We'll be covering the IS curve, which is chapter 21 in Michigan Techs. In this chapter, we'll be reviewing the IS schedule. And it describes the way the economy works and its relationship between the real interest rate and aggregate output. Our objectives for this chapter are to list the four components of aggregate demand. We will describe and list the factors that determine the four components. We're going to solve the goods market equilibrium, and I will describe why the IS curve slopes downward and why the economy heads to a goods market equilibrium. Finally, I'll list the factors that shift the IS curve, and I'll describe how they shift the IS curve. So our aggregate demand. Well, the total quantity demanded of an economy's output is the sum of four types of spending. You have consumption expenditure, planned investment spending, government purchases, and net exports. The components of aggregate demand: consumption expenditure and the consumption function. Income is by far the most important factor in determining consumption spending. Disposable income is income less taxes. The marginal propensity to consume, MPC, is the slope of the consumption function. Keynes said there is no automatic mechanism ensuring the planned savings is equal to planned investment. The change in consumer expenditure that results from an additional dollar of disposable income is autonomous consumer expenditure. The amount of consumer expenditure that is independent of disposable income, how much will be spent when disposable income is zero. So let's talk about planned investment spending. A fixed investment is always planned. Inventory investment can be unplanned. Planned investment spending depends on interest rates and expectations. While net exports, made up of two components, autonomous net exports and the part of net exports that is affected by changes in real interest rates. This is the net export function. Government purchase and tax. The government affects aggregate demand in two ways: through its purchases and through taxes. Goods market equilibrium. Keynes recognized that equilibrium would occur in the economy when the total quantity of output produced in the economy equals the total amount of aggregate demand, or planned expenditure. Solving for goods market equilibrium, aggregate output equals consumption expenditure plus planned investment spending plus government purchases plus net exports. So to understand the IS curve, what the IS curve tells us, well, it traces out points at which goods market is in equilibrium. It examines equilibrium where aggregate output equals aggregate demand. It assumes fixed price level where nominal and real quantities are the same. And the IS curve is the relationship between equilibrium aggregate output and the interest rate. We know that the IS curve expresses an inverse relationship between interest rates and income, assuming equality between investment and saving. Note that I equals S, it's the equilibrium condition. Remember, saving is a function of income, and investment is a function of interest rate. The shape of the IS curve depends on assumption regarding the responsiveness of expenditures to changes in the rate of interest. You can think of it like a demand curve. There is an inverse relationship between investment and interest rate. So let's look at an IS curve. The downward sloping IS curve represents points at which the goods market is in equilibrium. For example, look at point A and B. Notice the output changes as necessary to return to market equilibrium. For example, at point G in the orange shaded area, an excess supply of goods exists, and firms will cut production, decreasing aggregate output to the equilibrium at point A. At point H in the blue shaded area, an excess demand for goods exists. So, firms will increase production and aggregate output will increase toward the equilibrium at point B. So why does the economy head towards the equilibrium? Well, interest rates and planned investment spending. There is a negative relationship, and interest rates and net exports also has a negative relationship. So the IS curve, the points at which the total quantity of goods produced equals the total quantity of goods demanded. Output tends to move towards the point on the curve that satisfies the good market equilibrium. So some factors that shift the IS curve. The IS curve shifts whenever there is a change in autonomous factors, which are factors that are independent of aggregate output and of the real interest rate. One example, and the example that I'm going to use here, is changes in government purchases. So let's look at an application of policy and how it affects the IS curve in the real world. So the United States was involved in Vietnam beginning in the 1960s. Usually when there's a period where you have massive government purchases or expenditures, when they rise rapidly, typically central banks will raise real interest rates to keep the economy from growing too rapidly, from overheating. In the Vietnam War period, however, it was unusual because the Fed decided to keep interest rates constant. And this provides an excellent example of how we can look at the IS curve and inform policy.
So let's talk about what happens to an IS curve when government spending goes up. We make our Keynesian cross. On the y-axis we have expenditures, aggregate expenditures, and then on the x-axis we have income. Well, we want to relate real interest rates to aggregate GDP. So then we first think about planned expenditures. Planned expenditures is equal to aggregate consumer spending, which is a function of income minus taxes. Then we have planned investment. So, plus planned investment. We assume the rate is fixed, and plus government spending, and plus net exports. So YP, this curve is the planned investment. Here we have our equilibrium GDP. We can use this interest rate information to plot at least one point on our IS curve. So we want to relate the real interest rate, R, with aggregate GDP, Y. Well, we know if interest rate 1 is sitting at R1, we know the aggregate level of output is at Y on the Keynesian cross. Then we can draw our IS curve. If we want to try different interest rates, we would plot a number of points on our IS curve. So if we have a higher interest rate, we will have a lower aggregate income. So let's think about what happens when government spending goes up. Well, when government spending goes up, that will shift our planned expenditures up. The change in government spending will shift the curve up, and you get a new level of income. So we increase government spending with the rate staying constant, so that we shifted YP up. So if you increase government spending, ceteris paribus, you shift the IS curve. Likewise, had we reduced government spending, we would have shifted the IS curve to the left. So we look at the ISLM model. We just showed that an increase in government spending will shift the IS curve. So a shift in the IS curve should, as we see on the ISLM model, increase the interest rate. But that's not what happened. So what happened during Vietnam? Well, in the absence of a tax increase or a raise in the interest rate, the businesses and consumers just kept spending. And to meet the demand of the marketplace, new expensive factories had to be built, and workers demanded higher wages. In short, demand exceeded the economy's ability to supply, and everything began to cost more. But that's not what happened. During Vietnam, in the U.S. economy, the increase in government spending without the Fed raising the rate caused dramatic inflation. And according to Friedman, the increase in the money supply is effective in the short run. But in the long run, such actions are neutralized, as reflected in the vertical aggregate supply curve. So what happened in Vietnam, there was an increase in government spending, which increased aggregate demand, it increased prices, and dramatically increased GDP. But then workers realize that their real wages have fallen. Well, workers demand higher wages, and aggregate supply pulls inward. The economy moves from E2 to E3, and the implication is fiscal policy is ineffective in the long run. So what happened during Vietnam? In the absence of a tax increase or a raise in interest rates, businesses and consumers just kept spending. And to meet the demand of the marketplace, new expensive factories had to be built, and workers demanded higher wages. In short, the demand exceeded the economy's ability to supply, and everything began to cost more.
So while the increased military spending did shift the IS curve to the right, Federal Reserve actions kept the interest rates constant, and that did cause a drastic increase in aggregate output. But it also created a situation where inflation rose more rapidly than it would have had the Fed raised the interest rate. I just discussed how government spending in the early 60s shifted the IS curve outward, and how not raising the interest rates had an effect on the economy. There are other variables that will shift the IS curve. Autonomous consumption expenditure will shift it outward to the right. An increase in autonomous investment will also shift it out to the right. As I just noted, government spending, an increase in government spending will shift it outward to the right. An increase in taxes, however, an increase in taxes will shift the IS curve to the left as it decreases disposable income. Autonomous net exports. Well, when there's a rise in net exports, that shifts the IS schedule to the right. And finally, financial frictions. Financial frictions has a negative impact on the IS schedule. It shifts it to the left.